start with there's a seat in some auditorium seats. Yeah. I'll do the truck for the welcome, and then you introduce. Then they each see what the time order is. The idea was that she would and then hand over to you. For you. Yeah, sort of set the tone for they're going to actually just respond to those presentations. So after the three presentations.
Oh yeah, I have that one.
Okay, great.
Okay, perfect.
So everyone will
That works well.
Three presentations. We're going to allow like Weiping and Kate, if they want to take 5 minutes to just present it, and then you would moderate, and obviously you have however you want to approach it.
Oh, hi, Jeff, how are you? Michael Gilman, nice to meet you too. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to what you're going to do. Yeah, first.
Jeff is first, yes. So the order is, so the way it's going to work is our dean is going to.
What's that?
Well, I think it's not a physical tape.
Right. Oh, no, I look at the online thing, but I just, I thought it was.
Yeah, great. Oh, very nice to meet you.
Well, we have one. Yeah, that's what we call a circle. Some. I'm the Disney director of before. So, hi.
Nice to meet you. I'm working here as a planning consultant as well. Yeah, working for.
It's nice to get out and talk about it. You guys are doing great.
Yeah. So did you work with like 10 Virgin?
Yes.
Did it? Because you know he took a whole bunch of white students when he was doing Cornell. Is anyone still continues to be part of that? I'd love to hear more about that.
Students for package then is actually
Because he moved up to Boston. I used to meet him. Invited him to ours and to talk about that work. He used to be at Cornell. He took a bunch of students out of basically that's it.
and they work on the
Right. Yeah. Are you going to hear much or just? They also have line of
good to meet you. I usually do these things for you.
So is this a series?
Well, well, so we always do events every Monday and Saturday, or Monday and Friday. Usually a panel or conference.
Okay.
There is just a broader interest within the school around climate issues, and we have had a number of conferences related topics. We had actually, these are some books I wanted to give you that are related to what we've been doing lately. So one of our faculty members, Jessica Keenan, was in real estate program actually, but has been working a lot in policy in DC on climate issues. So this book just came out from our office, and then also this was related to a conference we did last year. It was around climate and scales of environment.
This is cool.
So it's definitely
I love this.
interest of the school and interest of the dean. And so we're really excited to have conversations more about policy. Where this is maybe this conference is maybe more academic in nature, but multidisciplinary. This is maybe from a planning perspective.
Right.
Kind of gives you kind of the breadth, I guess, of those two.
Oh, that's awesome. That'll be my reading list.
Yeah.
I'll be flipping through this week. Good. So we're doing presentations, commentary, Michael will kind of go, and then will there be Q&A in the audience?
No, we're expecting a big crowd. There's a lot of interest from outside of school.
When I was an undergraduate, I did an internship at the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and I did a lot of buildings research in Weiping.
So did you stay in New York here after undergrad? Or you went back to New York?
No, I stayed here for a bit, and then I went to NYC for grad school, and then I went back to New York and worked for a few years, and then Katrina happened, and I moved back. Yeah, Kate, good to meet you.
Everyone comes on strong with the questions. So I'm like, what are they? Like responded to get out of it. I went to teaches in our urban design program. Okay. So I said, what is like a slow dissection of realistic training.
I think you guys will get a first shot.
We get a first shot.
Respond, and then you can. Well, this is just yours. Hi.
I got it at 2 a.m. People get upset about airport cars. You get there when you get there, especially when it's a weather problem.
Non-fiction.
Yeah, the thing that if I was to ask myself a question would be about
Yeah, and it's like the imagination.
what we are doing in the city is if you take the worst case scenario, it's so incremental. How do we actually bring That's the question I ask myself. Right? Because the way funding works and everything is just so it's not just in the US, it's around the world. That's the
We have an interesting take. I mean, just in general, sort of what is
Yeah, exactly.
both for reflecting the current situations, but also this general take, whatever that looks like.
Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Welcome. I'm Amal Andraus. I'm the Dean of the school, and I'm really delighted to have a fantastic group of speakers today to think about, not only think, but also act on the question of cities and climate change. This conversation is part of an ongoing series of discussions we've had and continue to have at the school here on resiliency. I'm looking at climate change from various disciplines, climate change as discourse, climate change as kind of opening up new forms of engagement. And yesterday, I just wanted to mention we had a fantastic and inspiring and kind of scary, slightly scary book launch with Kim Stanley Robinson. And for those of you who don't know him, he's an amazing science fiction writer, also a Jamesonian, who wrote the Mars trilogy and is very committed to the environment and kind of, writing as a way to advocate for new ways to engage with those issues. And the cover is really striking because it's basically New York as Venice. New York after 50 feet of water have rised, and he describes this kind of new life that takes place in 2040 of people, quite localized, trying to kind of rebuild different forms of institutions, and as he said, it was a kind of love letter to New York as a city whose kind of beauty and infrastructure and history allows it to kind of find a way to be reborn. But as he explains, science fiction isn't just about projecting into the future in a kind of very, very serious way and enlisting the imagination to kind of visualize and try to kind of understand what the future might hold, but it's also always a reflection on the present. And what are the ways in which we're organizing ourselves now, and what can we do, and how can we already start the conversation of climate change is here. What are we doing about it? And so I'm very excited to introduce briefly Michael Kimmelman, who I hope you all know is the architecture critic at the New York Times, and certainly has set a very strong, very distinctive, and very important tone for that kind of column, which is to really think about people, think about cities, and to think about how we bring back kind of architecture, urbanism, planning, to really engage with the important issues that cities are facing today. And he's started to really kind of write about cities and climate change and is teaching about it this semester. We're really happy to have him in a seminar that brings together all of the disciplines here at the school. And for those of you who know me, this is one of the main projects, is to kind of think across scales and break the silos, and certainly climate change creates that renewed urgency. So please join me in welcoming Michael, who will kind of introduce and moderate the conversation today. Thank you.
Hi. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Amal. I should say it's a pleasure to be back here. I taught this morning, and just across the hall. And as Amal said, the really wonderful thing about the classes, for me, is it's bringing together people from the Earth Institute as well as people from GSAPP, and really any conversation, I think, about cities and about climate change has to engage people across a wide spectrum who are interested in the things that are inextricably bound up with both urban affairs and the ways in which climate affects them. And those are things like social equity and economic development, infrastructure, as well as things like creating green spaces and fair and diverse housing and so forth. And one of the interesting things I think that is, I take it for granted that here in this audience we know the large globalizing trends. This is the first urban century in human history. That rapid urbanization goes hand in hand with the effects of climate change on rural areas, and so mass migrations from rural areas to cities, putting pressure on so many different cities, especially in the global south. And those pressures are not exactly new. And I think one of the important things about climate change is not that it is only about islands in the South Pacific, which are now being drowned by rising seas, but it is something that is affecting virtually every city on the planet. And this connection between climate and its various manifestations, climate change and its various manifestations, and urbanization and the problems of cities, their economic and social problems and opportunities, that connection is really critical. I've begun a series for the Times, the second part of which actually just came out a few hours ago, on the Pearl River Delta cities. The first part of which was about Mexico City, and I chose it because Mexico City is an inland city a mile up. It's not a coastal city, but it was for me a good way of saying even cities that are not Miami are affected by climate change in the sense that you have evidence of rising temperatures, more severe storms, periods of drought, and that these kinds of effects can act as a tipping point, the spark in the tinder, really, for cities where you already have existing problems, social problems, problems of informality, and infrastructural problems, all of which are bound up together. To see climate change as integrated into these issues is really key, because the solutions to climate change, the ways we need to address it, have to also take into account all of these other challenges and opportunities. I think climate change needs to be seen as not just a thing in the future, but an absolutely present and critical issue now, but also as an opportunity, a way of addressing these various problems. And then making clear to people that climate change is not something that exists in some faraway place and that is an isolated issue, but that is an accelerator of existing problems and therefore needs to be dealt with just like all the things we see as the urgent issues in our major cities today. I'm thrilled that we're talking about this, the cities we are talking about today, and that we have the people we do to focus on them. Adam Freed is the now principal at Bloomberg Associates and was a former deputy director under Mayor Bloomberg in the Office of Sustainability. And Adam teaches here, I believe, as well. There you are. And I can testify from his coming to my class very generously. He's really fantastic on exactly this question of the integration of climate issues with other urban issues. Jeffrey Hebert is the deputy mayor and chief resilience officer in the city of New Orleans, which I believe had some incident a few years ago, which I'm sure they'll talk about, and I'm guessing that issues of equity, economic redevelopment, and so forth are inseparable from, as well as governance and the failures of governance and preparedness. Kate Orff, who's the founder of SCAPE and is an associate professor and director of urban design here, is also the person who brought me to teach here in this course, and I'm with them all, and I'm very grateful for that. And Kate has been involved, among other things, with the Rebuild by Design projects that were following Hurricane Sandy here in New York. Rodrigo Rosa is a visiting research scholar here at Columbia and a legislative consultant in the Federal Senate in Brazil. And you're going to talk about Rio, a city of unbelievable fascination and complexity, where climate is one of many, I'm sure, again, integrated issues of development and equity. And Weiping Wu is the professor and director of urban planning program here at Columbia, and I'm very grateful to her for talking me through the China piece that I wrote, and I'm sure is the absolutely ideal person to talk about this with us today. So without further ado, who's first up to bat? Great, Jeffrey Hebert. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Dean, for the invitation. It's very nice to be in my second home of New York. I was an undergraduate on the other end of Broadway, and this is my sister's alma mater. And when I have the free time to get out of my office, I'm an adjunct lecturer at Tulane University School of Architecture. So this brings me back to a place that I enjoy and not sitting in my office today, which is fantastic. So I'm going to really get to Michael's points. My presentation will go through really where we started at Hurricane Katrina and how we've sort of rebuilt the city since then and sort of pivoted towards the future of the city, not looking back at Hurricane Katrina exclusively, but looking forward 50 to 100 years ahead at what we will face in New Orleans and how we're trying to prepare for it through many sets of interventions. So as Michael mentioned, there was this small event called Hurricane Katrina that hit the city in August 2005, the costliest disaster in U.S. history. 1,800 people died. 80% of the city of New Orleans was basically destroyed. It had lasting effects on all systems in New Orleans, from infrastructure, including buildings and protection, all the way down to the social systems of the city. And we knew that the city had to be rebuilt much more strong than it was in the past. So as many of you know, and some of you probably were involved in, we went through about a decade of planning of what the city should be for the future. And it had many, this is documented, many fits and starts, but really picking up in about 2007 with the Unified New Orleans Plan, our master plan in 2010, the update to our hazard mitigation plan right at the end of 2010, which finally took into account the semblances of what we understood about climate change and sea level rise. Then the state's coastal master plan, which came out in 2012, which introduced the multiple lines of defense strategy, starting at the coast, what we call coast to curb, and then coming into the city and how you deal with urban water management there. Then really thinking about, in about 2012, thinking about, all right, what are the social issues, what are the economic issues that we need to really address as we're trying to build a city for the future that are part and parcel of thinking about infrastructure and the physical side. So a prosperity NOLA strategy came out in 2013, which is about economic opportunity. In between that, we put together the Greater New Orleans Urban Water Plan, which was when we started to understand how we should better prepare the city to deal with urban water management. So not just pumping, but how do you deal with nature-based solutions to solve some of the problems that we had in the past, but also looking at precipitation that we are tracking for the future, and how do we begin to reshape our urban environment to deal with those conditions that we knew were coming our way. Our NOLA for Life initiative, which came right after that, which was dealing with urban violence, which many cities across the world that actually are also on the front lines of climate change also have violence issues. And there's some political conversations about that and what's going on in Syria and other places. And then finally, in 2015, wrapping all that up through the initiative that we're part of through 100 Resilient Cities and the Rockefeller Foundation, really pulling all those pieces together, pivoting to the future and looking at projections 50 and 100 years out around climate change, but also our social systems, and producing our resilient strategy, which actually we released to coincide with the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And we did that intentionally so as to move away from just thinking about, all right, we have to rebuild from Hurricane Katrina, but actually moving forward and thinking about how do we have to build a city for the future. So one of the things I just wanted to talk about very briefly is how we really made that pivot to go from the past, which is, for New Orleanians, it was all about what happened at Hurricane Katrina and the post-Katrina condition. And we felt that the time was ripe to pivot from just thinking about that one incident to thinking about all the things that could happen to us in the future. So we went through a strategy process with stakeholders, and you'll notice that we had about 350 stakeholders involved in this and about 1,000 at the end of the day, because we had been through 10 years, a decade of planning involving tens of thousands of people. And what this was meant to do is really pull all those pieces together, put it into a strategy that looked at all of the systems in a comprehensive way, and then move forward as a plan for the future. And what that allowed us to do is think back to all of the things that we've been able to accomplish. So as I am here today, 87% of the population is back. About 90% of the city looks either as it did before Katrina or better than it did before Katrina. There clearly is still a huge amount of work left to do, but that the city, from a post-Katrina recovery perspective, was doing quite well. But as we pivot to the future and think about what's coming our way, it was time to really understand the conditions of sea level rise and how climate change is exacerbating conditions that were already present. So the first thing is to realize that New Orleans is a coastal city. People in New Orleans seem to not think about it that way, but it is. We have this giant thing that we call a lake here that is our northern boundary, the city. As you can see, the developed areas here. We call it a lake, but it is an estuary of the Gulf of Mexico. So as sea level rises in the Gulf of Mexico, sea level rises in Lake Pontchartrain and is a huge existential threat for the city of New Orleans. In addition to, this is land that is rapidly going away. We have the highest level of relative sea level rise in the world. And so what's going on here, where you're already having the first traces of climate migration in the United States from these low-lying areas up to the cities that are a little bit further to the north, has a huge impact on what happens to the city of New Orleans. So our Delta system, which is connected to both the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico, and thinking about what happens outside of the city and how it impacts the city is where we sort of pivoted. So our resilience strategy was really divided into three categories. The first was adapt to thrive, and that in order for us to survive for the future, we have to be a city that embraces our changing environment. We have to advocate for coastal protection restoration, which happens outside of the city, but has a huge impact on the protection of the city. We have to invest in comprehensive and innovative urban water management inside the city. We have to incentivize property owners to invest in risk reduction on their own property. We have to create a culture of environmental awareness at every stage of life, particularly beginning with children. And we have to commit to mitigating our climate impact. The second piece was connect to opportunity. And in order for us to be a thriving city of the future, we have to be an equitable city. So we have to invest in financial stability for households, because one of the things that we learned after Katrina, and one of the things you see around the world, is the most vulnerable people of the world are the people who are most impacted by climate change. And in many instances, they are the ones with the least amount of resources to adapt. The second is to lower barriers to workforce participation, continuing to promote equitable public health outcomes, continuing to build social cohesion, which is, from the Katrina standpoint, what we saw is the communities that came back more quickly were the communities that had a great deal of social cohesion. And expanding access to safe and affordable housing, which is something that I think around the world cities are dealing with. And the final thing is, when you're in I will say this relatively old city for US standards, a city that's 300 years old, some of our systems are completely outdated. Some of our processes are outdated, and in order for us to move forward, we have to be more dynamic to prepare for the future. So redesigning our regional transit system, promoting sustainability as a growth strategy. This is a huge sort of leap for us as an oil and gas community. Improving the redundancy and reliability of our energy infrastructure, which is, like a lot of places, very fragile to climate change. Integrating resilience-driven decision-making across public agencies, meaning the themes that I'm talking about in this in this condition, how do we start to integrate those themes and that thinking across city government agencies so that it's not just the Office of Resilience and Sustainability talking about this and trying to align plans, but that is a part of the planning of the Department of Public Works. It's a part of planning of parks and parkways. It's planning that is integrated in each department, so the thinking is not just coming from above from the mayor, but that it is a part of the everyday thinking of each of the line departments. Investing in pre-disaster planning for post-disaster recovery, which I think many of us have learned around the world is much more important than the work that happens afterwards when a disaster occurs, although in the U.S. Is not something that the U.S. government invests in, which is a huge problem. And then developing the preparedness of businesses and neighborhoods, because what we also found after Katrina, and you see this after Sandy as well, is the more robust and prepared a business is, particularly markets and other things that people rely on, that impacts the ability for a neighborhood to come back more quickly. If there are services in the neighborhood, people can come back more quickly. So climate, our climate is changing. Without global action, the number of days New Orleans experiences temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit will rapidly increase. This is something that we can get into more detail about. Sea level rise, as I discussed before, because we also face coastal subsidence. South Louisiana is facing the highest rate of relative sea level rise in the world, and this is a graphic that we use to try to explain to people what this means if you're an average height person, which I don't think I'm average height, but this is a little bit beyond my height. What 2100 ground level is based on the projected rates of subsidence, and what you see as sea level, and how close we're getting to our levee system at what happens at 2100, and where you see we are today. So yes, there is some likelihood of protection, and we've invested very heavily in our protection system, but the likelihood of future failure, and I don't mean this in a structural way, I mean just because of the impact of storm surge on what already happens with sea level rise, the ability of that infrastructure that has already been built to maintain the level of preparedness that a city like New Orleans depends on is not what you see in the Netherlands and other places that really have a more robust approach, more robust national approach to infrastructure funding to protect assets. So this is what that looks like. After Hurricane Katrina, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers invested $14 billion in the hurricane risk reduction system around the city. We have the largest storm surge barrier in the world. This is one of the largest floodgates in the world to protect the city. But as I said before, this was built, frankly, on science that was already a little bit more conservative than it needed to be at the time. And when we add in the issues related to what we see as the rising seas, the sea level rise projections for New Orleans, and what we know we can model on tropical storms and hurricanes and the ability of storm surge to impact that, it's something that makes us think about, have we really prepared for the future, and is there another way that we need to adapt to live in this environment? This is just a picture of the surge barrier, and I like to use this picture because one of the things that it demonstrates is after a huge disaster in the United States, there's always funding and thinking about large infrastructure projects. But I love to show this picture because we did build the largest storm surge barrier in the world. But what we really are trying to invest in, which we think has an even greater impact when you put the two together, are the nature-based solutions, which of course are eroding over time and disappearing because of sea level rise, as well as the gray infrastructure solution. In tandem, they can work very well together, but if you have one without the other, the risk profile is just that much higher. So as we have invested in this, we're starting to think about how to better invest in this system, which is costly, but is a part of our $50 billion coastal master plan to really start to rebuild the natural protection system as a part of the overall protection system of the city. So as I mentioned before, this is the multiple lines of defense approach. You start with barrier islands, you have land bridges, all these are naturally occurring, natural ridges, foundations of highways and other things that can protect communities. You have the floodgates. And then you get into the urban water infrastructure where the city needs to learn how to live with the amount of precipitation that we have today, the amount of precipitation that is projected for the future, and our ability to adapt to an environment that we sort of placed a system over the natural system. It's now time to sort of let the natural system come back and be a sponge for that with which we have frankly paved over the last 300 years. When doing that, we really have to think about designing projects for multiple benefits, as Michael mentioned before. So yes, we want to reduce risk of flooding and subsidence, but we also want to use many of those projects, particularly in the urban area, for neighborhood revitalization and economic development, improved health and quality of life, and environmental education and workforce development, so that we're putting all the pieces together to have a comprehensive lens to look through as we develop our projects. Community education and engagement is extremely important, particularly in New Orleans, where for the past 50 years, when we really started focusing almost exclusively on hard engineering, we're having to change the mindset of folks so that they understand that in order for us to live in this city in the future, we can't just think about it as everything is protected by a wall. We have to think about what we need to do on our own property, how we need to change our environment to live more cohesively with what we're seeing happening. So what that means is things are going to look different than they did in the past. Water will be visible, whereas before water was just pushed out. And we have to do that in order to remain the city that we always want to be. Tying it to workforce development, so the jobs of producing the future city should go to those people who are underemployed and undertrained. And we are right now in our first class of a training cohort for folks who are unemployed or underemployed to enter the workforce, the green economy, and the water economy, so that the people who need the jobs the most are the people who are building the future city. We have to, of course, take into account our flood zones. And we know that's going to get worse with what we see in precipitation, and how do we then retrofit the city to deal with that. So I'll leave just a few examples. This is one of our largest projects that we're working on today, which is a 25-acre site in a neighborhood that frankly used to be swamp until about 1930. And we're reusing that land as well as all the other public sites in that area, as well as medians and streets, to begin to retain water, to retain that future precipitation. And frankly, in the past 2 years, we've seen that future precipitation already. We're already beating what we've already been told we should see in 10 years. We're already seeing over the past 2 years. Then looking at our medians and how we can then absorb water in our medians, so as to pull back what we already know is happening, and how we need to completely re-engineer the city to adapt from a natural systems perspective. I will just quickly say that New Orleans pumps more than any other place in the United States, and only second to the Netherlands in the world. Those pumps are our largest driver of energy consumption in the city, and so by reducing the load on the pumping stations, we're also reducing our carbon footprint, which is a part of our overall climate strategy. So all of these things are sort of wrapped together. And then I'll leave this, my final slide, is in all of this and all of the things that we've thought about, that we're projecting for the future, that we've learned from Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, and other things around the world, yet we still must be prepared for the unexpected. This is February of this year, just a couple months ago, where a EF3 tornado touched down in the eastern half of New Orleans. That has never happened before. And so even though we are using projections that we are prepared for, the modelers will tell you this is called a tail of something that is at the very end of modeling that could happen once or twice, but it is something that is happening, and you're seeing more tails, particularly in the U.S. and other places in the world, than we've ever seen before. So even as we think about the things that climate change and sea level rising, we're preparing for those things. We're having these freak weather events happen that we're not even necessarily prepared for. So we should be prepared and continue to be prepared to adapt to anything, is what I will say, because we just don't know what's happening out there for sure. So finally, thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to the panel discussion later.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Well, Michael said invited Jeffrey to bat. I'm not sure if I'll be able to bat. I still try to understand the rules of baseball yet, but I'll try to kick some ball here, soccer ball, which is, and of course bring us some perspective of the reality we have in Rio and how the climate change is affecting us and what role we can play in terms of cities. This actually, I would start. We've been talking about why cities. Cities have been gaining more and more an increasing role in a world scenario. Issues that used to be exclusive of nation states, as climate change, as immigration, the refugee situation, security. It's increasing, becoming an issue for mayors around the world and the communities. Part of that is because, of course, we are becoming more urban, right? North America, Europe already are largely urban. Latin America was the first developing region in the world to become urban. It's going to be the most urbanized in a few years. And of course, Asia and Africa catching up. And the cities can be places when, of course, we can be healthier, richer, more educated, more equal and happier. But if we don't plan it well, if we don't consider things for the future, also can be places of violence, of poverty, exclusion, and vulnerability. And of course, in a developing world, you have to, as Michael said, understand the situation, the circumstances, and of the developing level the stage that we are. And that's what I'm going to show a little bit. This is an expression of the economic power of cities. They are, some of the cities are more important than, of course, the countries. That shows, this is a graphic from The Economist. The top 100 economies in the world, if we can combine in this exercise with countries, companies, and cities, we would have 34 cities among the top 100 economies. If the G20 had seriously to take into consideration, of course, this is an exercise here, it would have to bring on the table the mayor of Tokyo, mayor of New York, and Los Angeles, and before some of the presidents of some of the countries. Cities are places of concentration of wealth and also of population. Many of the people in the world gather in the large cities. The C40 climate leadership group, which the Rio was the chair in the past years, following Mayor Bloomberg. The only 100 largest cities in the world concentrate 25% of the GDP and 600 million of people. If this would be a country, it would be the third largest country in the world. But of course, the global governance design is not yet prepared to understand the relevance of mayors, of local leaders, and also to design policies adequate for the urban scenario. This is the city of Manaus. This was a refugee crisis in Brazil. It's not an exclusive problem of the Middle East or Europe. We also are facing this. There's a lot of immigration from refugees and other reasons from developing countries to developing countries. We have to issue 4,000 refugee visas for these Haitian people. And of course, these people come and they pressure the urban systems. And in Brazil, for example, healthcare is free and universal. You cannot deny healthcare for a refugee or an immigrant. If Germany had received 1 million of people, of refugees in 2015, as the International Organization of Immigration says, that means that Berlin actually received 10,000 refugees alone. So we have to understand the issue in terms of how it's affecting the functioning of cities, especially in the developing world. We can see by Lebanon, for example, which has 4 million people and is dealing with over 1 million refugees from the Syria crisis. Brazil is doing some work on this. We're among the top countries that give actually Syrian refugee visas, just a little ahead of the United States. And the International Organization of Immigration expects that climate change, as Michael said, is aggravating the situation. We had 21 million people displaced by disasters since 2008, which is a likelihood of 60% more than it was 4 decades ago. And of course, that aggravates also some concerns. A terrorist attack in Russia raises the concern here in New York City and gets everyone concerned by it. This is a graphic that shows how the refugee crisis is aggravating. This is in Germany. The number of asylum applications in Germany have gone up since the last years. The same here in Brazil, more than 20 times as used to be. And cities and mayors have gradually been empowered, despite this still a lack of enforcement. Rio has a very long tradition on sustainable and climate negotiations. As you remember, the first United Nations conference that understood the problem as a problem for society was in Rio, 1992. We haven't had much progress in the following years in Kyoto and Copenhagen. But of course, Brazil played actually a strong role articulating the BRICS, which is a group that is actually a quite unique idea of a bloc. Of course, they are not territorially connected and unite countries as Brazil, India, South Africa, and Russia and China. They're not necessarily very similar, but in the climate negotiations, they somewhat found a common ground and have been articulating these past years their positions, which it's a good sign how this thing is becoming global. But of course, we need to strengthen this, what we call the multi-dimensional geopolitics, right? It's not only about the nations. Mayors have to be brought on the table. Benjamin Barber, many of you have heard, he defends that mayors should rule the world. Of course, he makes an exaggeration around that. But he says that because, of course, mayors are problem solvers. There's, like Bloomberg like to say, there's no Republican or Democratic way to collect the trash. And they understand that they have to do what it works. And of course, their response is being what the nations should work on, which is cooperating, right? And I think the organizations as C40 should are an example of how they have been cooperating, especially nowadays with in this new era and with the fight against populism and demagogues, of course, from left to right, xenophobia, and the leadership of mayors, of local leaders, is very critical. And also other manifestations of that. For example, the mayor of Paris strengthens the agenda of the women leadership, and was recently here in Colombia in an event talking about women leadership. We have a very short deadline. This recent report from C40 says basically we need to reduce our emissions per capita from 5 to 3 under 3 points per capita by 2030. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to keep the temperature rise under 1.5 degrees, which will avoid the most drastic effects of climate change. And if all the cities over 100,000 people could reduce take actions, we would do half of the work that needs to be done. Of course, the main work still is with the cities from developed world, which from the developed world, which have a much higher rate of emissions per capita, but also this is a work that has to be done in the developing world as well. That's why the new IPCC report will have a specifically chapter and cities to understand, because they understood that the solution has to comprehend the functioning of the urban systems. This is a favela of Rio, Favela da Rocinha. 20% of the population of Rio lives in slums. And also, this is a problem that is in New York, in Rio, and it's a sign of how the urban expansion has been chaotic and dysfunctional. We need to think on climate policies, also considering that kind of condition. Still, the solutions that have been mostly brought on the table in developing countries are to use private developers to build homes and real estate market, but you need to understand the urban policies as a whole, right? In Brazil, we had a recent housing program called My Home, My Life. We gave out 4 million homes in the country, but did not understand the issue concerning transportation or public services as well. So if you keep picking those part-time solutions, they're going to actually aggravate the problem in the long run. Those are the main consequences of the most extreme climate effects in Rio, landslides and floodings. This is a picture from 2010 when you had an extreme event, Jeffrey, just like you had there, and it killed 60 people in Rio. It really made the mayor back then, I was part of the administration, understand that the climate policy could not be something that was a rhetorical priority, but not an effective priority, because we saw at present how the climate had been changing, and how big the losses can be. So we basically start design the policies with mitigation, of course, and adaptation, right? What we call more recently resilience. This is a mitigation. We set up legislation of climate change. The first one in the city, expecting to reduce 16% of the emissions from 2009 for 2016. We included that in the Olympic program of the city. And of course, we start from a lower base in terms of per capita emissions. This is a comparison from the emissions in Rio and other cities as well. As you can see, the developed world has much larger tons per capita. But that, as I said before, that doesn't mean we don't have to act or do things. This is the profile, but we have to understand the particular characteristics of the emissions in Rio. Most of the emissions in the city are solid waste and transportation. We don't emit much in housing and buildings like you do because of to heat. So we have been working on this, and the main policies were also included in the Olympic plan. We built 4 BRT lines, and also transferred our waste disposal to a more modern landfill and a waste treatment center, I would say, and avoiding the emissions that were done before. In terms of resilience, this is a center of operation. This is a situation room. Again, we took somewhat the advantage of having the Olympics to somewhat of attract partners to develop this. This was a laboratory thing, was presented in a TED Talk by the mayor a few years ago, and it has, of course, high-end technology to gather big data and try to predict. Our predictions of weather there are much less accurate than you guys have here. We have to develop those weather models to predict the weather specifically in Rio. But this, more than the technology, this shows that you know how these extreme events, they don't choose any time, they don't choose time to happen, right? Sometimes it goes overnight, it goes on the weekends, on holidays, And you really need to adjust the coordination of your departments. So not because of the technology, but the most important thing I would say is to gather all the departments together. This has over 30 departments, and taking decisions, connecting in a very effective way to the mayor. This was also in the Olympic plan. Usually things in Brazil end up being built or happening right before the event. But I think the mayor, after the rains that we had in 2010, was clever in the sense that he would anticipate that somewhat of a situation room for that would happen just for the games, and amplify that to something that would be lasting and to the city as a legacy, and developing also some technology and expertise. We also designed a resilience plan, Jeffrey, just like you did in New Orleans. We're part of the 100 Resilient Cities network. It was the first plan in Latin America, and of course, it was an exercise on trying to think on in a long term, building scenarios in terms of vulnerability of poor communities. It's still in a very early stage, and try to predict those black swan scenarios, as you mentioned. We had recently the upsurge of yellow fever in Brazil, which was an epidemic that was gone for over 5 decades and is very lethal. It's 1 out of 2 die, and as Michael said, the combination of elements sometimes aggravates the problem. Many of people today are not protected. They don't have the necessary vaccine to yellow fever, and it is the same. The way it spreads out is mostly by the mosquito of dengue, of the Zika, and if you don't act fast in the urban community to try to control the problem, that can create a catastrophe to the city. So we have to be prepared for these unplanned events as well. And of course, planning for the future. This is a picture of Guanabara Bay and the recent renovated port area in Rio, also one of the Olympic legacies. I remember when we were in discussions in the municipal department on how to plan this renovation, considering the elevation of sea level, and of course the culture and the engineers didn't want to redo their plans or incorporate new variables, but it was fortunately enough early in the project that we could pressure and reinforce the protection against elevation of sea level. And in fact, this is not going to be a very high area of elevation of the sea level in Rio. The west part will suffer more, at least according to the models we have. But still, it showed that how the climate component is being slowly incorporated in the planning design of the city. I think that's it. I'll be here for questions and looking forward to the debate. Thank you.
So I will move us up further north now, going from New Orleans to Rio, back to New York City, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here. As Michael mentioned, I teach both at SIPA and at SUMA, so it's nice to come to a building that I'm normally not in and learn more about what other programs are offering. I also want to particularly thank Michael, because the work that you do and the columns that you post on climate change are critically important. You know, as important as the science and making sure we're taking a data-driven approach and understanding our risk, the storytelling is absolutely critical to make people understand what that risk means, to make it relevant to people, and to really catalyze action. And the work that you've done and colleagues at the New York Times is really second to none. I also want to note that as excited as I am and as positive I am about the role of cities and the importance of cities, as Rodrigo noted and as you saw from the first talk, the innovative things that cities are doing, I think this is the century of cities. I think cities are the demonstrated leaders on so many issues. That does not mean that our federal and state governments can abdicate their responsibility to take action. So while we're doing amazing things, the risk does loom for federal and state preemption to cut off many of the programs and the funding streams that have enabled New Orleans to recover and thrive so well, that enabled New York to bounce back after what we faced here with Hurricane Sandy. So stay positive, stay excited, but stay engaged. So I want to talk quickly about the work that has been going on in New York. And I do also apologize, I'm going to have to leave a little early from the discussion afterwards. It's not because I'm running out because I'm scared of your questions. I have a flight that I need to catch, so my apologies for that. What was interesting about New York, and we've talked about climate and climate change as an opportunity, all of our climate work in New York and our sustainability actions had absolutely nothing to do with climate change. It started with this graph that projected that by the year 2030, New York was going to increase by 1 million people. And our mayor at the time, Michael Bloomberg, said, well, what does that mean? What do we have to do to accommodate that growth? Because we think growth is good, growth is necessary for the city. We want to accommodate those people, but we want to do so in a way that builds our economy and doesn't impinge on and actually enhances the quality of life for our existing New Yorkers. And we knew that meant that we needed to upgrade our infrastructure. For anyone who recognizes this picture because you've been stuck in traffic on the BQE, our infrastructure today in New York, or in 2007 when we started on this question, was already outdated and couldn't handle the traffic, the flow, the pressures we were putting on it already, forgetting about 1 million more people, forgetting about climate change. So we said we have 1 million more people, we need to update our aging and outdated infrastructure, and we're in a global economy. You actually don't need to live in New York anymore to work on Wall Street. You don't need to have a Madison Avenue address to have an advertising firm. You have to want to be here. So how do we make a city that attracts the people, that attracts the talent, that attracts then the companies and their tax revenues to be here? And you've seen this now as Nashville is a growing economy, not because they have a history in finance, a history in tech, but because people want to live in that city. So they're one of the fastest growing job centers and population centers in the country. So we thought about, well, what do we do to make the city a place people want to be? And we knew that climate change was a clear and present danger today when we were doing this. This is pre-Sandy, but we knew we had heat waves every year. We had torrential downpours. We had the August 8th, 2007 rain burst that shut down the subway system. So we knew that we faced real and significant climate risks without climate change. We knew climate change was going to get worse. How do we take that into account as we're thinking about our city's future? And then we also, and this has been added in more recent years much more explicitly, any of these questions bring up the issues of equality and bring up the issues of social inclusion. So how do you make these long-term infrastructure investments? How do you think about the future of the city and do so in a way that raises kind of everyone up in the city and makes more equality and addresses some of the social and economic inequalities that are systemic in our cities and in our societies? So all of that came out in a series of plans. I recognized and appreciated your slide. You know, it started in 2007 with the release of Plan NYC, which was the city's first comprehensive plan looking at the future of city from the 1965 kind of master plans for New York, which had 5 or 6 tomes, each this big, about that wide, that I think were opened once and then put on a shelf. We wanted to have an actionable document. We knew that we did not have all the answers. In fact, we weren't even asking all the questions in 2007. So we worked with the City Council to enact a law that requires the city to update its sustainability plan once every 4 years. Every new mayor has to ask these questions. What does the next 20 years look like for the city? It has to incorporate climate change. We have to do an annual progress report that publicly releases how we're doing on this. You have to have updated climate change projections once every 5 years. And we have to have a greenhouse gas inventory every year by law. So we wanted to institutionalize this long-term planning so it wasn't another 40 years until you had someone coming along and begin to ask these questions. So we had the Plan NYC update in 2011. Post-Sandy, we expanded that and took what was one chapter on climate resilience into over a 200-page plan about how are we going to look at not just strengthening the city and reacting to Sandy, but how are we going to think about the long litany and list of risks that we face. Then, and this is what our hope was, the next administration came, and because by law the city is required to update its sustainability plan, you had the evolution into One NYC. That was looking at what is that long-term future for the city and how do we want to address not just climate change, but a lot of the threats we face. I'm going to focus on what's in there in climate. So we've talked about climate adaptation. We've talked a lot about the risks we face. We also, on the other side of that coin, have climate mitigation. New York is the largest city in the world to commit to an 80% reduction in its GHG emissions by 2050. This is the waterfall chart that just gives you a sense of where those reductions have to come from. Unlike Rio, the largest share for us is buildings. Over 2/3 of our emissions come from buildings. 1.1 million buildings in the city. The benefit of being in a small, dense environment, we have small apartments. We have shared walls, so we share the heat from our apartments next to us. We can walk places. It means we have a lower carbon footprint when it comes to transportation, but we need to clean up our building stock. Much of this is existing buildings. We need to clean up our power supply. We need to look at our transportation network, but we're already pretty efficient. The per capita carbon footprint of a New Yorker is 1/3 the national average because of a lot of these issues. And then we get a little bit out of solid waste. Talked about buildings, 1.1 million buildings in the city. We really wanted to follow the data, and under the Mayor Bloomberg, we looked at the information and found that just 2% of our building stock, those are all the buildings that are over 50,000 square feet, were responsible for half of the energy use in buildings. So we had the choice of going after 20,000 buildings, and there are large buildings, usually owned by large companies, very sophisticated management structures, and saying, we need to work with you to lower your carbon emissions. Or we could go after the other million building owners, many of them small distributed, and try to work with them. We wanted to go after the 2%. And so we enacted the Greener Greater Buildings Plan, which required a whole series of lighting upgrades, audits, retro-commissioning processes, benchmarking, so that publicly disclosed energy and water use. On these large buildings, an estimate that's going to be 5% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions, the single largest action the city could take at that time to reduce our carbon emissions, just going after 2% of our building stock. And by the way, it would save those building owners $750 million a year in reduced energy costs, and we estimated it would create about 18,000 jobs in the city, looking at that opportunity side. We also knew we needed to clean up our energy supply system. The state is doing a large effort now, and Governor Cuomo deserves a lot of credit for the New York REV, a program that's looking at energy systems and distribution and transmission throughout the state. We also know there's an opportunity in the city on distributed generation, and things like Hurricane Sandy, things like Katrina have taught us, relying on big systems mean that they were more likely to fail. And when they do fail, you'll have catastrophic results. I live in Lower Manhattan. I was that dark part of the previous slide when we lost power. Thankfully, I live on the 3rd floor. I could walk up and down, but all of our buildings, if you lose power and you're more than 6 stories tall, you lose water. And that is a bigger impact than power when you have 2 children and a wife and no water for 5 days. So looking at distributed systems, looking at utility scale solar, and how can that help the city be more resilient as we meet our carbon reduction goal. And looking at microgrids. This is actually a pilot now that's happening in Brooklyn. 30 houses and brownstones are coming together. They're installing solar on different rooftops. They're actually sharing it within a network so you can buy it from your neighbor and have a distributed generation in a microgrid. What are those innovations that we can look at that the city can help enable, but it's really allowing private action and individuals to take more control of their destiny, help us meet those long-term goals, and enhance the resilience of the city. Transportation is a major issue in the city. This was the traditional response. You need to build more subways. You need to go underground. Very expensive. If you look at the history of the 2nd Avenue subway, very long period of time to make it happen. We are doing that. That is important for the city. But it's also looking about how you use your assets that already exist much better. 25% of the city is the public right-of-way. It's streets and sidewalks. It's not well utilized when it's fully dedicated to cars. How do we do things like introducing BRT and taking ideas from Curitiba and other cities in Latin America that had long been pioneering new ways of better utilizing transportation? We brought that to New York. We launched the Select Bus Service, saw a 20% increase in ridership and a 20% increase in bus speeds. And you can now see these throughout the city and continuing to be expanded. We launched the City Bike system. Now, I used to always joke that New York City has long had the largest and oldest bike share program in the world. In the 1980s, we had about 20,000 bikes stolen a year. So we've had a long practice of sharing with our neighbors. But we launched City Bike in the bike share program. And now in 2016, 2/3 of all rides on a bike share program in the US were in New York. Over 13 million rides on the City Bike system. Something that people fought against, thought didn't make sense, and now is wildly successful, and I think anyone who tries to get rid of it will face large challenges. And we needed to look at the infrastructure to go before this, expanding bike lanes, making sure the infrastructure is there for bike parking, but wildly successful at giving people more sustainable transportation options. And as I said, designing the cities not for cars, not for modes of transportation, but for people. When I first moved to New York, I still avoided Times Square because it looked like this. And who would have thought that you could turn it literally overnight into a pedestrian plaza and bring that to neighborhoods throughout the city, having a dramatic impact not only on the streets, but increasing rents, increasing retail value and the revenue that stores are having, improving air quality, and really creating hubs within communities. So now there's a public plaza program where neighborhoods are volunteering and asking and applying to have plazas brought to their communities. As you're doing all of that, as you're looking at your infrastructure, public health, I think, if you're trying to get people engaged in climate change, if you're trying to get them to think about it, much more than greenhouse gas emissions, much more than polar bears, talking about the impact on public health is the way to motivate people. And even in New York today, 8% of all deaths in the city can be attributed to poor air quality. And again, we followed the data and we understood that half of the air pollution in the city came from local sources. And we found that just 10,000 buildings, 1% of our building stock, was responsible for more PM2.5 than all cars and trucks combined. And we knew where those buildings were. They weren't moving around. They were registered and staying in New York. And it was because they were burning heavy heating oil, which is how they're heating themselves, which ends up in these plumes of smoke. And it turns out that in New York City, we regulate boilers in the city. Every 3 years, you need to renew your permit. So we said, you're stranded in the city. We control you. We regulate you every 3 years. And you're the biggest source of local air pollution. So this is what our air quality looked like in the winter of 2008. All these black areas are air pollution areas. And what was really interesting, by putting street-level air quality monitors out in the street and measuring where emissions were, this is not an EJ issue. This is not something that's limited to low-income neighborhoods. At that time, Mayor Bloomberg, who may not be considered a lower-income person, lived on the Upper East Side, worked in Lower Manhattan. You saw the Upper West Side, the Upper East Side. Some of the wealthiest areas in the city had some of the worst air quality. They had no idea. It helped us build a much better political base to say this is a critical issue to focus on. This is about the South Bronx. This is about asthma rates. But there is a large amount of people who need to come together to help address this issue, because this is where a lot of the sources of air pollution were coming. So we enacted legislation. We phased out heavy heating oil. We said you can't burn it anymore in the city. You have to transition over the long term to much cleaner fuels. There's great stories behind the shenanigans and machinations that had to happen with Albany and the city council to make this happen. But in just 3 years, we went from this to that. We phased out heavy heating oil in 6,000 buildings. 65% drop in PM2.5 from these buildings, 70% reduction in overall sulfur emissions throughout the city. New York City now has the cleanest air quality it's had in over 50 years. We can only go back 50 years because that's when the record started, just from one policy. And this is the second biggest public health initiative during Mayor Bloomberg's term after the smoking ban indoors. So huge effort, and it's helping us reduce our climate change emissions. We never, ever talked about that. Brings us to climate risks as well. Every inch of rain we get in the city, it's 1 billion gallons of stormwater. We need to capture, treat, store, try to ameliorate before it goes into our water bodies so we don't pollute our waterways. That is a really big challenge. You can do it by building bigger treatment plants. You can do it by increasing the size of your pipes. You can do it by building underground storage tanks, which have no value other than when it rains. We think that there's a better way. Distributed generation, I'm sure Kate's going to talk a lot about this, with green infrastructure and stormwater management, where we're working now to capture the first inch of rain on 10% of the land area in the city. And as I mentioned, 25% of the city is hardscaped right-of-way. 1.6 billion square feet of the city is rooftops. There's a lot of opportunities to better utilize that area, turning it into bioswales, that neighborhood beautification, help combat the urban heat island effect, increase property value, looking at green roofs, looking at the green belt, the blue belt in Staten Island. So the city now has over 4,000 green infrastructure installations throughout the city that act as a distributed system to capture stormwater, to retain it, to hold it back so we don't have flooding events, so we can have better water quality, and we have a greener, lusher city. Multiple benefits, and by the way, it's cheaper than the traditional responses of gray infrastructure. More complicated to try to make sure it works as a whole system. You have to make sure that the regulators agree to it and have confidence it'll work, but the benefits are really astronomical. And that brings us then to our changing environment. Because one of our biggest challenges is we don't always know how to manage the environment we face, and we have a changing environmental baseline. So we know that we face sea level rise, we know we face climate change in the city. Enormous amounts of the city are already in a 100-year floodplain. Those are those blue areas. That includes JFK Airport, that includes Newark, that includes part of Wall Street. With sea level rise, that'll get even more of the city. 25% of the city will be in a 1 in 100-year floodplain. That does not mean that you have a 1 in 100 chance of a flood happening. It means that if you bought a mortgage, you have a 1 in 3 chance in the lifespan of your mortgage over 30 years that you're going to face a flood of 8 to 13 feet. It's a very different way of thinking about that, I think, would get people acting differently. But there are things we can do about this. You know, man and cities have existed in floodplains and in climate risk areas forever. They're always at confluence of rivers. That's where the commerce is. You have to acknowledge your risk and you have to account for it. So there are a number of programs that are happening. Many of these predated Sandy. This is Brooklyn Bridge Park that was actually designed to accommodate flood. So you have riprap, so it can flood salt-tolerant materials. It faced little damage from Sandy because it was designed with sea level rise and with coastal storms in mind. There are new parks that are coming in that incorporate natural infrastructure, and we took the lesson from New Orleans. And you have hardscaping. Both of those working together provide benefits and can reduce your risk. We're looking at temporary solutions. No one wants to live facing a wall. People go to waterfront areas for a reason. There is increased risk, so how do you have mobile strategies that can be deployed? And how do you face heat waves? That's something that everyone always wants to talk about water. More people die a year from heat waves globally and from heat-related impacts than any other natural hazard combined. So we're painting rooftops white. We're really looking at how do we change the DNA of our city, from our source systems to our rooftops. And every facet of our built environment needs to change to incorporate and acknowledge and accommodate the risks that we face. It can be done. It can make a better city. You have to do it. You have to have the political will, and that's at the leadership first, but also from your legislative bodies. You need to put the money behind it. And in many cases, it's not building brand new infrastructure. It's adding 10% or 5%. We were building a park in Brooklyn Bridge. We needed to build it in a way that accommodated sea level rise, accommodated climate change, that may have added 5 or 10% to it. And all things have to be personal. The last thought I want to end at is how I think about this and why I dedicate my life to this. It's not because it's an esoteric issue. This is my father, who was born in 1945. At that time, the mean annual temperature in New York was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. When I was born in 1976, we had already increased a degree in our mean annual temperature, and New York saw 3.5 inches of sea level rise. At that point, we were then seeing about 2 weeks' worth of days over 90 degrees. Flash forward to my son being born in 2008, we'd already increased another degree temperature. We'd seen 4 more inches of sea level rise in New York. When my son goes to college, roughly, and this always dates me when people laugh at this if they know the movie or not, you're going to see even more temperature increase. We're going to be about 58 degrees, our mean annual temperature in New York. That's 5 degrees increase from when my father was born, 4-degree increase from when I was born. It means we go from 18 days a year over 90 degrees to 30 degrees, a full month over 90 degrees. That means Amtrak has to slow down and speed restrictions come in. It means our power grid can melt, huge health risks, and more increased mortality and mortality rates. We see infrastructure aging faster. You may have to change your airplanes and your runways to account for changes in air density. And we're going to see at that point now 2 feet of about a foot of sea level rise from when my father was born. And when you flash forward to when my son may have a child, we're seeing a dramatically different city. The mean annual temperature has gone up almost 10 degrees. We're now at 61 degrees Fahrenheit. You're seeing 2 months, maybe, of days over 90 degrees. That's a dramatically different city. And you're seeing 2 feet of sea level rise. So for me, I don't think about this as something that's theoretically going to happen. I care about my son. I care about his family, should he choose to have one. This is going to have real impacts on what the world looks like. This is a real and existential threat that we face. There are solutions to it. We need to have the will and the resources behind it to address it. So thank you for being here and for inviting me.
So do we want to start with the responses?
Okay, I'm Kate Orff. Thank you so much. I have a very brief response, and because I'm quite interested in getting to the questions, there's so much to be learned from the sort of shared experiences. I guess, first of all, just this a moment of sort of celebration and acknowledgement of all the successes that have been able to be achieved at the city scale. And I thought some of my remarks are more along the lines of what are the limits of the scale of the city relative to climate change? Because I feel that, Adam had brought this up in his remarks, that clearly cities are taking the lead relative to climate adaptation. It may be our only choice, right, at this moment, because cities are obviously large agglomerations and densities of populations that have a shared future, and so I think that I would just say to break that idea down into the limits of the scale of city into two sort of larger buckets. One being the kind of zone of regulatory challenges and governance, right? And each of these kind of large projects described, there has to be an alignment of city, state, and federal, at least in the state side context, an alignment of goals. And without that alignment, then the funding scenarios become incredibly difficult. Any project that goes outside a scale of any sort of a regional, a sort of very localized context requires a much more buy-in, if you will, on the city from a state and federal context. And the second bucket I wanted to talk about is literally not only the sort of governance scale of the city, but literally the physical spatial scale of the city as a kind of a limit to addressing climate change. Because, I think the graph that you showed, Rodrigo, also of the list of the highest, the most intense economies going from United States to Los Angeles to ExxonMobil to Barcelona really shows that these networks of power, the sort of fundamental economic or economy-wide reallocations and revaluing of these systems of fossil fuel generated energy sources and the larger scale value shifts that do need to occur to address climate change, not just adaptation or altering the physical landscape, are truly those that, as I would totally agree, require pressure at a kind of a federal scale. And it's these two issues that I'd be interested in talking more about.
Thank you. I'm Weiping Wu. Really enjoyed your presentations. I'm particularly impressed by how much the equity angle and the social justice angle are in your considerations. I'd like to actually follow up Kate's remarks in the sense that I think climate change really significantly aggravates this conflict or tension between market and policy. That is, it really calls for far more collective action in a sense, both across scales as well as across different population segments. And the interesting part is I hear this wonderful work that New Orleans is doing in terms of mobilizing communities to plan ahead of time. But we also know that as people become more urban, the more traditional social networks and relations disappear. So we know when people move from rural to urban areas, that kind of connection, that kind of self-help networks disappear or are reduced. But we also know there's research that has shown, for instance, in Chicago, the heat waves, that the presence of social capital and networks are very significant in reducing fatality as well as increasing recovery. And so as we look at all of these very effective strategies to overcome the inertias in the built environment, can we think about also ways in which the urban built environment is reconstructed first to facilitate more interactions, or to facilitate what Robert Putnam would call the churches of the neighborhood, right? Where in which you would increase more interactions, and in some Northern European city designs to sort of communal shared housing, especially when we were looking already at a huge increasing elements of shared economy and governance in cities. And I was reading a little bit about the proposed plan for the Hudson Yard in terms of the exhibition, the architectural space, and that kind of sort of new kinds of built environment that could really rethink and help us rethink the human interactions among each other. So right now we're sort of addressing more of the human and environmental interactions. And I think, climate change gives us that opportunity perhaps to think together in that sense. That is something that I think it's bringing in further elements in addition to the environmental justice elements that have been in here. And I would love to hear what you have to add.
So I'm really glad that Weiping and Kate moved this conversation instantly into the two areas which are both critical to climate change and also are, in a way, I'm sure the problem is that you're all aware of, and those do have to do with governance and the governance on different levels, because, let's face it, there's a whole kind of rhetoric of the city and the mayor, which has been developed, which along with the boxes that can be ticked by mayors to prove that they have, the right climate strategies, and all of those are good, but are entirely ineffectual if you do not have governance at a larger scale, and no bike lane is in itself going to solve Rio's climate and other problems. And then this, I think this this issue that Weiping brings up, which is so key, and I'm glad you mentioned Eric Kleinenberg's book too, this question of social resilience as being inextricable from climate resilience, because we know, and several of you brought this up too, really everybody did, I think, in some context, that the climate is not just about building levees, it's not just about creating, sponge parks. It does have, on some fundamental level, to do with creating community and to creating an environment of social justice and environmental justice, which prepares people for the problems that we will have. I think one of the interesting things, in the case of a country like the Netherlands, which is always held up for all the annoying reasons as the perfect country. Nonetheless, one of the interesting things about the strategy there is it is so tied to social resilience as well, and this notion that somehow the communities have to be they can't just exist behind levees. But I mention it not just to remind people of the annoying Netherlands, but also to raise one other issue. I just wanted to talk to you about this a little bit, and that is, in a place like that, they complain that people have become complacent, because if you build this relationship between public awareness and participation and sort of the gray infrastructure and other governmental sort of efforts is a constant balancing act. In the Netherlands, people have come to feel that water has been taken care of. And so this question of emergency preparedness and that kind of community resilience is an issue. So I just wanted to raise that myself as one thing. And then let me just plunge in with a direct question. So in Rio, my impression is, and maybe this is a way of saying, can you talk about some of the countervailing tensions? You had the Olympics, which was supposed to be an accelerator of progressive urban redevelopment and adding rapid bus and so forth. You had a lot of social conflict that was around some of the Olympic construction. And my impression is that a lot of the Olympic redevelopment along the waterfront and to the north was one thing, but there's also a persistent, economically driven and class division driven sprawl to the west in gated communities. And so, correct me, a city like Rio is a really interesting case of two countervailing, strongly countervailing and sort of canceling out tendencies. And I'm just wondering if you could talk to that and how, because it's not, you're not alone in that, how you deal with that kind of tension.
Should I just start? Well, starting from your last question, of course, Rio is in a somewhat of higher level of inequality than New York, which is an equal city for American standards. And I think there is a lot of misconception and misunderstanding on the developments, like in specific of what we broadly call the Olympic investments or the recent investments in the city. Almost all of the investment was done in the poor areas of Rio, which traditionally lacked of, for example, public service as transportation. So all the BRT lines were done connecting the area of the city that had absent public access to transportation. Also, there was a large expansion of healthcare. We went from 2% of the population covered by primary care to over 50% of the population. And built over 70 health family clinics, or basically healthcare units that focused on the most needed areas of the city. But in fact, to make such a strong intervention in the city's tissue, there was needed relocations, but to build bus corridors that would benefit the whole society. And what we have had now looked in the past years is that helped to reduce inequality in the city. But this is a long-term challenge. I would say there is somewhat of a collective learning about the community feeling. I think in New Orleans we were talking about this, how deep-rooted culture and the community engagement can be valuable to the development of communities, both in Rio, New Orleans, New York in its sense as well. And we're taking advantage of something like that, but it's a long-term challenge.
Yeah, Adam.
So, responding to two of the previous comments and then following with that, the role of cities and the idea of connecting to other areas, two statistics with that. 70% of global emissions come from cities, which is the good news. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory did a report that estimated what proportion of the carbon reductions in the U.S. needed to meet the Paris Agreement could come from cities. They estimated on a moderate scale 15%, under a super aggressive scenario 35%. So cities are really important, but they're not the whole story. In New York, how we can get to 80 by 50 and how we measure that out, on the energy side, it's fully dependent on the RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard in New York State, that projects that 50% of the energy in the state is going to come from renewable energy by 2030. If that doesn't happen, if we can't clean up our power supply, we can get a lot through efficiency in buildings, and that's really important. But if they're drawing from, if you're drawing a hybrid car, but it's still pulling, or an electric vehicle from a coal power plant, that's a major problem. So cities are important, but others. Talking about markets, I think the two challenges we face, or big challenge we face, is pricing. There's no price on carbon, there's no price on the externalities caused by pollution. We don't price risk well, so people live in risky areas because insurance is so low. That's right. Because they can build there. And our bonds are really bad. You can get a 30-year bond, or a city can go out for a municipal bond to build something new in a higher risk area, and there's no downgrading or increased percentage rate that they have to repay that on. Likewise, renewable energy and some of the climate mitigation strategies are viewed as riskier, than fossil fuel investments, even though there's greater price fluctuation in fossil fuels. So we're not pricing these things correctly. Maybe I'll stop there and let others answer the social cohesion.
Yeah, I want to go back to the comment about cities and mayors, and I think, you know, our mayor is a member of all the networks, and we actually believe in the philosophy that mayors can make change. But then I think one of the things that we're beginning to think more strategically about is between cities and metros.
Regions.
The regions.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And you know, in the U.S. and all over the world, cities and the regions that they are in sometimes have varying political factions against each other, the big city versus the smaller suburbs or the smaller towns or the other areas of the region. And really, in order for us to continue to scale up what we need to do, we have to be more involved in regions. So, you know, New Orleans has a very strong mayor form of government, same as New York City and other cities. But the ability for us to go beyond the city scale and go up to the regional scale and the jurisdictions outside of cities is that much more important to make that change. I mean, when we look at New Orleans in particular, you know, sea level rise, as it impacts the city of New Orleans, also impacts the neighboring jurisdictions, right? That's all linked together. What's done at the coast impacts us all. So the ability to get beyond the strong leadership of the strong mayors, but get beyond that and bring our regions together is even more important. I was in Melbourne, Australia 2 months ago, and they really are thinking hard about, Melbourne itself is very small, and there are, I think, 33 governments around Melbourne that make up what you would normally conceive of as the city of Melbourne. I mean, it's contiguous. You don't even know you're in a different place. And so the ability there to get 33 other governments around the issues that the city of Melbourne itself, which is actually quite small, is putting forth as strong leadership, I think is the next level that we have to get to, because these issues cross boundaries. This is not just about the cities. And then on the national level, you know, Mayor Landrieu will be coming into being the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and one of the things that we're thinking very hard about is how mayors can exert political muscle, and how mayors as groups can push national governments, not just in the U.S., but around the world, to a different place. And that's sort of, at this point, where we have to really focus our energies, because that's where we are. And then the last thing I'll say on the piece about traditional ways of life and traditional connections, as we were talking about, Rodrigo and I were talking about, New Orleans has a very strong culture, carnival-based culture, very much like Brazil. And those carnival organizations are very deeply held, deeply seated connections for social cohesion in the city. However, what's happening is with the scale of this, of course, is quite different from New York, but what's happening with affordable housing and housing affordability, where we have 57% of the people of New Orleans who are spending almost over 50% of their income on housing, and you're seeing massive displacement as new investment comes into the city. That's starting to disrupt those traditional cultural connections. And that is concerning for us, because that is where you get the cohesion, and that's where you get the ability for people to take care of one another, which is critically important as we move into the future. So it's a connection, as you were saying, Michael, before, this is a web of connections between, in this particular case, culture, housing, and the outcomes of being able to be resilient, that it begins to become a cultural preservation issue as well.
Could I just build on for 2 seconds on the regional point too, because I find that to be an incredibly important point. And in the urban design studio in the past couple of years, we've done a series of studies on global cities and climate adaptation. But rather, we found very quickly, like when we went to Rio last year, we didn't stay in Rio. All the students were quite disappointed that they weren't dancing in the parades. We went out along the Rio Paraíba River, which is really the source of the drinking water, frankly, for Rio, right? So you really have to look at an upstream environment. Similarly, this year, we're looking at both Amman, Jordan, and the Jordan River Valley. And in, thanks, Adam. At Calcutta, India, you know, a mega city, which is in obviously different scale, but like New Orleans, is highly interdependent upon a regional wetland ecosystem, which is at the Ganges Delta. So it's funny how we, even in just trying to address this topic, our entire frame of defining what a city is, if you will, has changed.
Yeah, you were going to say.
Maybe just to really quickly follow up on that, there are precedents, so if you look at Chesapeake Bay, right, in Virginia and Maryland, there's long tradition of that cross-state, even collaboration, of course, requires political will and the commitment. But, it's interesting why, Michael, you were writing that article about China, all Chinese cities are one big government. It doesn't necessarily lend itself to really, progressive actions. And so I think certainly there's that in there, but I think if you look at London, the Greater London has been able to achieve many things that are equally challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you were saying this, I was thinking, you're right about Melbourne. In that same country, Sydney does not have the same municipal agreements. And that's a very good example of a federal government, national government, which has been reluctant, shall we say, to deal with climate issues. So, you can have in certain places where that's the cohesive possibility. Look, I mean, even in New York, God knows you don't have a better example of the ways in which what seem like even basic, simple moves like congestion pricing, which worked in London, is not possible here because the suburban commuters don't want it, and Albany doesn't want it. So it's very difficult. I think one of the key things is finding strategies, finding common ground, and shaping arguments that may be climate driven ultimately, but serve other purposes. Finding common ground across those political and social divides is really the way to begin to build those coalitions, political and other coalitions. I'm sorry Adam left at that moment, because one of the things he talked about when he came to my class, we were using as a kind of example the plastic bag ban, and which failed in New York, and where it has worked in other cases, and how one could reframe this. It's not going to solve all of our environmental problems, but it seems like on one level a no-brainer. And that in the Chesapeake area there was a kind of coalition of different people around whom the idea of cleaning the river became something that was sort of socially, here it got tied up in the governor-mayor issues, and in the idea that the money would go back to the stores. So maybe the point is strategically beginning to think of policy as something that can build those coalitions on a case-by-case basis and a city-by-city basis. There isn't a kind of toolkit of interchangeable parts.
Yeah, I think the metropolitan challenge is it's a huge anywhere. In Brazil, there is some specific situations after the Constitution of '88. States, federal government, and municipalities have the same level of, let's say, as institutions, 3 level, but there's no metropolitan coordination. It's pretty much up to the state governor to have its own leadership, and as we said before, in fact, national governments have not pushed this agenda forward. But of course, as metropolitan areas grow, the problems become more and more integrated. And we really need to change that perception and start to think. I think climate change in the environment are natural issues that this lack of governance brings about.
I mean, they should be, but let's face it, for most people, and this is certainly true of most Americans, if they even acknowledge climate change exists, it is not high on their list of demands, for a lot of understandable reasons. But I do think that things that are related to climate change, whether it's, in China, clean air, I mean, that's a very clear issue. So one can, again, target certain ideas and issues without having to have buy-in from everybody that climate change is the driver.
To that point, I'll just posit this. We had a conversation last week or 2 weeks ago. I serve on the Governor's Advisory Commission for Coastal Restoration, and we're talking about the state's coastal master plan, which is regional and is built on 30 years of talking about coastal restoration, which really comes from the fisheries industry. And that was sort of the entree into that conversation many years ago. But when we're looking at funding and how do we talk about this, what came up in that meeting very publicly and a lot of discussion about is the national defense issues related to sea level rise and climate change for cities across the U.S., military installations both in the U.S. and around the world that the government controls, and the fact that the Defense Department was the first to recognize climate change in the U.S. government. And so do we pivot to having a conversation of climate change as a national defense issue in order to raise the awareness and raise the issues around it in this current environment? And there was a really serious conversation of that. How do you continue to get attention in this when the U.S. Defense Department sees it as one of their most existential threats? So it's a really interesting way of trying to weave, conversations to make this relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in all cases, that's a really great example, that defense and economic development.
Yep.
I mean, the reason London has been so effective, of course, is because London basically is the British economy. I think it accounts for a third or almost 40% of the economy. So the massive investments in infrastructural development and new transit and all that sort of thing, and the government is based in London too, it's an easier argument. But it can be made in other cases as well. Where's the economy growing? I'll shut up, but I should let you guys talk more. But one of the things that occurs to me as we're speaking is climate change is linked, as we see, to urbanization. Urbanization is linked to the climate problems that have caused rural failures and in some cases conflict that causes migration. And those urban-rural divisions, which are linked to climate change, are expressed in the United States as well in political terms. So the question becomes, how do we bridge this conversation across rural-urban divides and show people that somehow these are shared problems? It's complicated because the political constituencies are quite different, and the perception of resources and division of resources is different. People in red states think that blue states are taking more money from the till, the federal till, even though it's in fact the other way around. And that is a really difficult mindset to change. It has to, I think, to stem from a feeling that this step, whether it's defense or some kind of economic corporate benefit, is going to help them. So.
I have to leave.
Oh, you're leaving too?
No, thank
This is like musical chairs. Eventually.
I'm trying to
Thank you.
Michael, if you could expand that point in your book, I think that will be an excellent book, because I do feel like, at least in the U.S. context, that is literally the crux of the problem right now. I think the other, just to build on that point, is the other issue is around just representational governance. I mean, I think the borough of the Bronx is the same population as West Virginia, for example, right? So you have those challenges relative to the urbanization of the United States and how this inflects back and how this projects forward is a tremendous question. I do feel like also concept of storytelling and narrative is critical. SCAPE, our office, has also begun to work more in places that are primarily, we initially primarily focused on coastal flooding, but the fact is there's riverine flooding, there's increased tornadoes in many, so we have projects now in North Dakota where people are looking for some of the same strategies that are, I think that, the key is to try to develop a series of physical interventions that themselves beget and kind of trigger more social cohesion, right? So that the physical remaking of the environment works in tandem with a kind of a social project. There's risks in that, I suppose, but I do feel like that is part of the key relative to, the remark about, how can we see climate adaptation as a benefit and as a way to improve. And so if we can somehow understand and shift the discussion just away from coastal flooding in the blue states, which it is not. It is about increased risk in almost, in every micro environment or every regional economy. And shift that discussion, and that will be a critical shift.
To build that social cohesion, we need, the last thing we should be talking about is carbon, and translate to that to the communities. And what the message to the Bronx is different to North Dakota, is different in the rich areas of Rio, and is different in the poor communities of Rio. We still talk the same, even like us here. Yeah. We are still talking the same scientific approach, or which is the root of the problem. But we need to build that coalition, to build better governments. We need to translate that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes out of a very basic economic argument as well. I mean, the argument for resilience works on all economic levels, but it's rarely made. It's made as a kind of ethical, moral, and environmental issue, and that is in itself, I think, a social divider. But there's a good economic reason.
Two things on that. I think the outreach and community education in the language that people speak is important, as you were saying. I mean, we're using highly technical language, but being able to translate that highly technical language into what matters for people the most, and meeting them where they are, I think is important. And I think a lot of places we've started to do that. And I think, we are in an architecture school. I think it is extremely important, I believe it's extremely important that we do have physical, tangible things for people to see as demonstrations that can start to try to change some behavior. So one of the first things that we did, we started a pilot program to build demonstration rain garden sites that had educational signage, and we worked with the community groups to put them together so that people could start to understand what we're talking about and understand the risk. And as those things, they've been in for about 4 years now they understand it, now people are embracing it, and they actually understand how it works because they can actually see it. And that builds the capacity for you to do more. But that was based on sort of a very localized, neighborhood-based design process that led to pilots that then people could see, touch, feel, understand, see work over time, that could lead you to sort of the larger scale interventions that we're doing now. But this isn't a natural thing for people to just understand what we're talking about. And so you have to be able to talk about it in a way that people can understand it, and I feel very strongly about you have to do some sort of demonstration so that they can see, feel, touch, smell, proof of concept.
Yeah. I mean, and then maybe we open it up to some questions. But Kate is involved with one of the rebuild projects, but another one of the rebuild projects, which is the Big U that many people in this room may know about, I think is an interesting example of this kind of doing one thing and talking about another thing, essentially, which is that while Lower Manhattan, is threatened, and in a hypothetical world, we should not have our entire economic future based on the buildings that are there, they're not going to go away. So the question becomes, how do we protect that? So this idea of building a soft border has been around for a while, but the project, the Big U as it's called, that is beginning there, starts, after all, with a little segment, not so little, but pretty little, at a place where the East River is adjacent to public housing projects, which have been very underserved without access to the river and without recreation space and so forth. So the project is sold, that part of it at least, is sold as, it doesn't have to be sold as a climate thing, it doesn't have to be sold as a proof of concept of essentially a levy, but as a community benefit. That's right. And equity-based for a mayor coming in as well, who's running on this. That kind of strategy, that's right. I think is absolutely the only way to build buy-in, especially community buy-in. Do we have some questions? Sure.
I'm going to offer up a statement for reaction by the group. As I look at the headline up there, I do believe, and there were 3 great case studies today, of cities and climate action, especially if you elect the right political leadership as we did in this city at one time, almost miracles can happen. The picture of Times Square is a case in point. But what concerns me, and we've kind of danced into and out of it, if we change the word cities to intergovernmental relations and climate action, and the regionalism thing, which held great promise decades ago, when the federal government actually promoted it, graduate students studied it, and I did, and we even taught it. It's all forgotten now. People aren't interested in it as much. And then finally, big elephant in the room, based on all those executive orders that have been signed recently, is the federal government. And instead of climate action being something that everybody can embrace and kumbaya with, it becomes a political thing. And it seems one major party doesn't even believe in it. So in conclusion, I'd like to ask the panel, are you at all optimistic about intergovernmental relations and climate action? Because I'm not. I'm very optimistic about your cities and climate action because you're demonstrating what's going on and the best is yet to come.
You know, I remain cautiously optimistic, but to be honest, you know, we get a new executive order every day, 2 or 3. We have no idea what's going on, and I think, to be honest, in the U.S. and you know, we're in networks with cities all around the country. I think we've all just decided that we need to do what we can, and we have to just react. I mean, we literally, this is not even a joke. Every day, all of our cities, communications teams are reacting because there's something new every single day. This is a completely different territory than we've ever been in before. And so you'll see I probably have 4 or 5 emails now going around between different cities and is your mayor going to sign on to this thing that we have to send today? I mean, it's just we're in a completely different environment that I don't think we're necessarily prepared for. So I have to say I'm cautiously optimistic, but it remains to be seen. I mean, with this administration, they say one thing one day and then turn around and do something exactly opposite the next day. So you just don't know where you stand. This is very much so shifting sand here in the U.S.
Yeah, I think we're needing leadership, right? Cities have showed action within their boundaries. Maybe it's about time to the mayors now to advocate more on a national and intergovernmental level. Brazil is also going through its own intergovernmental crisis as well. And as I said in my speech, this is the perfect area for constructive perspectives, not destructive perspectives.
You know, I wrote about Mexico City in this series, and if you talk to officials in Mexico City, they say the same sorts of things that representatives from Rio and New Orleans here say. We have the following agenda we're trying to do. And when I then started to inquire about, and what kind of support do you get from the federal government, which is in league with a lot of this, it's very similar to the United States in that you have a federal government which sort of supports private development, sprawl, highways, every single thing that thwarts the efforts by that city. If you ask, how that works, they will tell you it doesn't work. In fact, the federal government recently in Mexico City cut to 0 all funding for all of these programs, that, including public transit, period, because the mayor of Mexico City was threatening to run for president, and so it was challenging. So this is not unique to the United States, where there are, in any case, existing hurdles, legal and otherwise, for the current administration to overcome. They can't completely undo everything. But saying that it's a huge problem, which is definitely the case, is not the same as saying that the only real way to move forward is somehow trying to build larger alliances or find common ground. One interesting case will be infrastructure. The president said he's interested in doing something infrastructural, and then it turns out he just wants to fund his friends, tax breaks for highways. But think about it. You have a project like Gateway, critical tunnels under the Hudson River, which are bound up with all the issues we're talking about here, which is also critical to the development of the West Side. And who was his closest advisor on infrastructure? One of the developers who runs Vornado, who has massive investments around Penn Station on the west side of Manhattan. So before we decide that this is a completely dysfunctional situation in which there's no hope of, and we've learned this, maybe some things need to be played out over a period of time. I'm not sounding too optimistic, but I'm just saying, I personally am not convinced that this is an impossible situation, even at the moment, if we can find these occasional places.
Just one quick footnote, not that it's perfect, but it's way ahead of the others. Portland and that metro area.
Yeah.
And more people could take a look at it, not adopt it verbatim, but no people aren't looking at it. Thank you.
Yeah. One more question? Somebody out there? Yeah. Where's that hand? Yeah.
Okay, so just quickly, I thought one very important example missing from this conversation, which I hugely appreciate and respect for the information and analysis you presented, is Paris. And I'm not talking about the Paris Treaty, I'm talking about Paris planning.
Yeah.
And I am a little biased because I have a book contract to write about regional planning in Paris. But the French have had, of course, state-led capitalist planning and highly dirigiste, and they didn't even have a mayor of Paris until '69, not since the revolution. So it really was the state with kind of what you could call a colonial governor, the préfet, who took care of everything. And while nobody was looking around 1965, they managed to come up with a regional plan for the entire region that was really very well coordinated, all things considered. I mean, there were many mistakes, and it happened to coincide with the nadir of architectural design, but that was a piece of it. But, they created La Défense as a big, so they didn't, destroy the center of Paris. They created the new towns. They created... But most importantly, transportation, which is what they are excellent at. And I want to point out one other quick thing about Paris, in that back when the French environmental movement became very big, around in the early 70s, the environmental poster was of the 5th arrondissement, one of the most densely populated urban areas in, I won't say the world, but certainly in the Western world. And at the same time in the United States, our poster, which was a Sierra Club poster, was, depicted a human being, I'll say, no gender, sort of contemplating nature in a state of solitude. So I think that goes a long way towards explaining a certain kind of, well, we were talking about rural and urban, but anyway, a certain view of nature, environment.
I would add to that the recent change to the governance structure of Paris with the metropolitan government coming into play, which adds another layer of that sort of more regional thinking in the Ile-de-France and that entire area.
Yeah, but one of the things about that change is that I would respectfully just disagree a little bit with what you said, because of course what actually happened when you had the growth of Paris was that you had the périphérique, which created a center and pushed all of the banlieue, the suburbs on the outskirts, to not all, but many of them impoverished, and you had a hub and spoke system of transportation, so that they couldn't. Their only jobs were coming into central Paris, and so there are fundamental structural problems at Paris that have always revolved around the centrality of Paris.
Yeah.
And this new metropolitan Paris and the notion of creating a transit system which will connect some of the outer lines, so it's the suburbs to each other, not just to the center. This is, in a way, remedial work, which I think is along the lines of what we're talking about, how to create a larger city and a more equitable city as well, I would hope. So.
I can only agree.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I hope that was enjoyable.
That's fantastic. Thank you.